I only wanted a roof, but something beneath the slate was still waiting for me.
She was 21 and homeless. No room, no tools, no family key, just a slate chip and $4 she had earned lettering 2 herb pots behind a church kitchen. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten slate garden marker shed outside Granville, Washington County, New York, absent from county maps since 1948. Rain entered through the north roof. The floor bowed beneath broken slate. The county had condemned it on October 3rd with demolition planned for the first thaw. But under a hinged slate rack, a rusted lettering frame had kept a sealed compartment untouched for decades, holding proof that would change her mother's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hannah Reed had been splitting things her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she split afternoons between school and the nursery rows where her mother tied graphs with waxed cotton and pressed handwritten labels into damp soil. Hannah learned that a plant could look dead above ground while keeping one green decision hidden below. Her mother set each knife carefully and let the wood show where it would open. Eleanor Reed had narrow wrists, soil beneath one thumbnail, and a way of listening to weather through propagation house glass. She promised Hannah the nursery tools when she became steady enough to use them well. The promise was never written, only practiced. The person who taught Hannah slate was her grandfather, Amos Reed, a marker cutter who had worked the Granville beds before his lungs forced him indoors. Every Saturday, he carried a canvas roll of carbide chisels to the nursery and chose one fallen roofing slate from the salvage pile. He showed Hannah how to find the bedding plane with a thumbnail, how to tap along the edge until the stone answered with a dry, even note, and how to split a thick piece into 2 marker blanks without bruising either face. At noon, they ate apple slices from wax paper. Then Amos clamped the blanks in a wooden lettering frame and made her draw plant names in chalk before touching steel to stone Baldwin Spitzenberg Northern Spy. He corrected spacing with a pencil, never by taking the chisel away. Stone remembers the hand that hurried it, he told her. Hannah understood years later. A bad blow traveled beneath the surface and waited for winter. Amos died in February during a week when snow sealed the nursery gates. His chisels, lettering frame, slate hammer, and brass dividers were stored beside Eleanor's grafting knives in a cedar chest. By spring, Eleanor was gone too, taken by a stroke before Hannah had learned how to ask about deeds, receipts, or ownership. The chest remained in Aunt Beverly's mudroom, smelling of cedar and old iron. Beverly controlled a room without raising her voice. She kept bills in labeled envelopes, wiped clean cups before anyone had finished drinking, and answered questions by straightening something that was already straight. After Eleanor's funeral, she said the nursery had debts. When buyers came, Beverly called the tools miscellaneous estate goods and stood before the cedar chest. She counted their cash twice and put it away without meeting Hannah's eyes. The eviction came on April 17. Hannah returned from pruning lilacs for a neighbor and found her canvas coat folded on the porch beneath her mother's blue enamel watering can. Beverly stood inside the screen door with one hand on the latch. Behind her, the cedar chest had left a pale rectangle on the mudroom floor. "You cannot stay here after tonight, Hannah Reed." Exactly 8 words delivered as though she were reading a label. Hannah picked up the watering can. Its rose was crushed flat dried moss clinging to the handle. Behind Beverly hung Eleanor's photograph beside 3 rows of young apple stock. Beverly looked past it. Hannah carried away not the closed door, but her mother's face left inside the house that had sold her work. For 6 weeks, Hannah moved south and east by whatever road cost least. In Whitehall, she slept 2 nights beneath the freight awning, waking whenever the rails began to sing. In Glens Falls, she paid $6 for a narrow bed at a women's mission, then spent 3 mornings washing cafe pans for meals. Saratoga Springs took more of her money than she expected. A laundromat chair cost nothing until midnight, but coffee, bandages, and bus fare reduced $27 to $19, then $11. She slept behind a Ballston Spa greenhouse under a Fort Edward church stair, and once in an equipment shed where fertilizer dust burned her throat. The slate chip stayed wrapped in her handkerchief. She used it to letter 2 herb pots for a church cook who paid $4 and gave her boiled eggs. By the end of May, those $4 were all she had left. Rain drove her into the Crandall Public Library in Glens Falls on a Thursday afternoon. She dried her sleeves beneath a reading lamp and opened the classified pages because the warm room required no purchase. Between an auction notice and an advertisement for laying hens, a 4-line county listing had been boxed in blue pencil: abandoned slate marker shed, Granville outskirts. Tax title, $4. Structure unsafe. Buyer removes or repairs. The word slate marker held her longer than the price. At the reference desk, she found Granville near the Vermont line, close enough to Amos's stories that she could hear his pencil tapping wood. The librarian wrote the county clerk's address on a discarded catalog card. Hannah folded it around her $4, tucked both inside her shoe, and left before caution became another locked door. At dawn, she would take the northbound bus as far as the money allowed. Somewhere beyond its last stop, a condemned shed was waiting with her family name already inside it. The bus carried Hannah north beneath low rain, past fields still holding winter in their ditches. Her $4 bought a seat only as far as Fort Anne, 22 miles short of Granville. From there she walked Route 149 with the catalog card inside her shoe and the crushed watering can tied to her pack. By dusk she had covered 14 miles. A farmer let her sleep in an open hay barn where the temperature fell to 37 degrees and mice moved beneath the straw. She reached Granville late the next morning with mud-dried pail on her cuffs. Main Street gathered itself in brick clapboard and Slate Scotty's coffee shop, Parker's Pharmacy, Granville Hardware, Meadowy Books, and the Slate Valley Diner with 3 pickups outside. Quarry dust lay in the curb seams. Even the church steps carried a blue-gray sheen. The county clerk's satellite office occupied 2 rooms behind a hallway smelling of wet wool and floor wax. Hannah waited at a counter worn smooth by elbows while a woman in a green cardigan stamped forms. One spectacle lens was thicker than the other, enlarging her left eye. The brass nameplate read MRS Eleanor Pike, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Pike examined the notice, then Hannah's 4 damp bills. You understand the roof is failing. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no water service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not insure it. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition begins after the thaw. Yes, ma'am. The clerk opened a ledger too large for the counter. Hannah signed beneath a legal description of 1 shed, 1 narrow lot, and an access strip no wider than a wagon road. Mrs. Pike pressed a brass county stamp into red ink, leaned her weight upon it, and left a circular seal beside the date. Take Main east to Quaker Street, she said. Bear left on Truthville Road. After 1 8/10 miles, look for 2 black walnuts and a stone culvert. The lane is nearly gone. Her finger stopped above the signature. Reed, she said. Was Amos Reed kin to you? My grandfather. Mrs. Pike removed her spectacles. Without the thick lens, her face seemed smaller. He lettered my mother's garden markers. Delphinium bee balm feverfew. He worked out that direction before his lungs went bad. There was a woman with him sometimes. Eleanor. My mother. The clerk rubbed her thumb along the deed. That shed belonged to Reed and Vale. The county lost the trade name when the parcel changed numbers. I thought all the Reeds had gone. Hannah did not explain who had sold the tools. She watched Mrs. Pike slide the deed across the counter. Keep it dry, the clerk said. Some records survive only because one person does. Mist followed Hannah out of town. Quaker Street lifted beyond the last close houses. A man repairing a mailbox raised 2 fingers. His old black dog followed Hannah for half a mile, stopping whenever she stopped until one whistle called it home. Truthville Road narrowed beside mossed stone walls and quarry cuts. Near the 2nd-mile marker, 2 black walnuts stood across a collapsed lane like gateposts. Beyond blackberry canes and burdock, the shed waited. It measured roughly 18 by 32 feet, with fieldstone below the windows and weathered hemlock above. The north roof sagged beneath broken slate shingles. A short brick chimney leaned away from the ridge. Over the door hung a board with fragments of lettering ED and VA Garin Mark RS. Hannah pushed with her shoulder. The door opened 6 inches, caught, then gave with a scraping sound through the floor. Cold mineral air touched her face. The front room smelled of wet slate mouse nests and stored soil. Her boot crushed a thin shard with the sound of breaking ice. Dust gritted her tongue. Somewhere inside the wall, water ticked into metal. A counter stood beneath 2 clouded windows with shallow shelves for finished markers. Her fingers found grit old nail heads and grooves left by rows of stone. Spider silk caught her cheek. Beyond the partition, something loose knocked softly in the wind. The back room had no intact window. Rain had blackened the floor beneath a hinged rack crowded with broken blanks. A rusted lettering frame stood bolted to a bench, its guides frozen open. Beside it lay a foot treadle, a splitting block, and a wooden mallet cracked along the grain. Hannah lifted the mallet. It fit her hand. She spent the afternoon clearing a space no wider than her body, stacking slate, sweeping mouse husks into a sack, and wedging a board beneath the worst leak. At dusk, she ate 1 boiled egg and carried water from a roadside pump in her mother's crushed can. Her bed was her coat over flattened feed sacks. Wind entered beneath the door and moved across her ankles. The roof clicked as the temperature fell. Once something small crossed the shelves and paused above her. Hannah placed Amos's slate chip beside her cheek. Through the floor she felt the cold patience of stone, and beneath the rain she heard the building settle around her, not welcoming her, not refusing her, simply making room. The stone had kept what the family could not. For 3 days Hannah learned the property by use. The well stood 40 paces behind the shed beneath a warped cedar cover. She lowered a stone on twine, first heard water after 6 seconds, then drew 3 buckets and discarded them before the 4th came clear enough to boil. The outhouse leaned toward a sumac thicket, its door held shut by a horseshoe nail. Inside, cold air rose through the seat boards, carrying the sharp smell of lime and old leaves. The floor had its own language. The plank beside the front counter gave one long complaint. 2 boards near the chimney answered with quick paired clicks. The passage into the workroom remained silent if she placed her foot close to the wall. By the 3rd night, Hannah could cross the building in darkness without waking the loose slate beneath the rack. She returned to town on the fourth morning carrying a list written on the back of the county notice. Granville Hardware occupied a narrow storefront with bins of carriage bolts beneath the windows and a brass bell that struck twice when the door opened. The place smelled of machine oil rope and the dry mineral dust that clung to quarrymen's cuffs. Its owner, Walter Klein, had a white mustache clipped square at the corners and only half of his right index finger. He read Hannah's list without asking where she lived. "I can pay after I find work," she said, "or I can sweep." Walter looked over her coat, her mud-stiff boots, and the slate chip she had placed on the counter as though it were a reference. "Your grandfather settled accounts every Friday," he said. "You can do the same when there is something to settle." He opened a ruled ledger and wrote Hannah Reed beneath the date. A stiff chimney brush cost $2.10. 20 feet of jointed rod cost $1.85. A half-pound of stove cement was 45 cents. Work gloves were 70 cents. A galvanized ash shovel cost 55 cents. Walter added a used claw hammer without entering a price. Then he reached beneath the counter and gave her a thin booklet titled Repairs for the Rural Householder. "Free with mistakes," he said. "Most people earn it." The chimney took 5 hours. Hannah first spread damp feed sacks around the hearth and tied one over the stove opening. From the roof, she removed the cracked rain cap, tested each slate shingle before trusting her weight, and fed the brush downward 1 rod at a time. The first pass stopped 8 feet below the crown. She twisted clockwise, never backward as the booklet instructed, until a hardened collar of creosote broke loose and fell with a heavy granular rush. She worked the brush through 12 full passes. Black flakes collected beneath the sack, some brittle as burned bark, others glossy and thick enough to bend before snapping. At the base, she opened the cleanout with a cold chisel and removed nearly 2 bushels of soot, bird nesting, and mortar chips. A split in the stove collar took stove cement pressed into the seam with a wet thumb. At dusk, she burned a twist of newspaper. The flame leaned toward the throat. Smoke rose cleanly. Hannah fed in dry walnut twigs, then 2 narrow pieces of hemlock from a fallen shelf. The stove ticked as iron warmed. Rust dust and cold stone gave way to the smell of wood smoke. She heated well water in the blue enamel can and cooked oats with the last egg broken through them. It was the first hot meal she had eaten indoors since April. She sat on the floor with the bowl between her palms and watched firelight move across the lettering frame. The next morning, she began to inventory the workroom. She found a slate-splitting chisel with its edge mushroomed by years of blows, a box of chalk sticks wrapped in newspaper from 1947, 2 brass spacing gauges, a hand-cranked grinding wheel with a leather belt gone stiff, a rack of wooden alphabet templates, a stoneworker's apron hardened with dust, and a shallow drawer holding carbide points in 6 widths. Beneath the bench lay a bundle of willow stakes intended for nursery rows, each sharpened at one end and tied with faded red cord. The hinged slate rack occupied most of the north wall. Its lower trays held broken blanks, but the upper section remained oddly level despite the floor's sag. Hannah removed the pieces one by one, tapping each with the wooden mallet. Whole slate rang thin and clean. Fractured pieces answered dully. At the center of the lowest tray, the sound changed. She tapped again. "Not slate, wood." Hannah pressed both hands beneath the tray and lifted. It was heavier on the left than the right, though the load had been cleared. She examined the hinges, then found a cedar disc fitted into the frame beneath a skin of slate dust. It was no wider than a jar lid and had 1 shallow notch cut along its edge. Her thumbnail could not move it. She warmed the disc with a cloth dipped in stove water, weighted, and worked the tip of a spacing gauge into the notch. The cedar turned 1/4 rotation. Somewhere below the rack, a hidden latch withdrew with a dry wooden click. The whole lettering frame shifted forward. Hannah knelt and pulled carefully. A narrow compartment opened beneath the rack, its interior lined with tarred paper. 3 packages lay inside, each wrapped in oiled canvas and tied with cotton tape. Nothing smelled damp. The cedar seal had held. She carried the packages to the front room and set them beside the stove. The first contained Amos's slate hammer, its ash handle darkened where his thumb had rested. Beneath it lay his carbide chisels, brass dividers, and the narrow burnishing stone he had used after every Saturday lesson. Hannah touched none of the cutting edges. She placed each tool in order upon a folded feed sack. The second package held raw slate blanks, 12 in all, split thin and trimmed square. Between them rested a grafting knife with a pearwood handle, Eleanor Reed burned into one side in small letters. There were bundles of nursery labels, unused waxed cotton, and 3 envelopes of apple seeds marked by orchard and year. The third package was a blue tin deed box. Its lid resisted until Hannah cleaned the hinge with stove oil. Inside were savings notes, royalty receipts, bank certificates, a folded planting map, and a sealed letter addressed only to the one who opens the frame. She did not open the letter. Instead, she counted. The savings notes had a face value of $31,000. Bank certificates added $11,500. Nursery royalty receipts endorsed but never deposited accounted for $4,500 more. Together, they made the precise $47,000 promised by the records. Beneath the papers lay $13.68 in old money 6, Morgan silver dollars 3, Walking Liberty half dollars 11, Mercury dimes 23, Indian head cents, and a folded $2 bill softened at every corner. The complete cash came to $47.13.68. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a nursery invoice, rested a purple heart in a black case. The reverse was engraved Thomas Vale, 1944. Hannah counted everything again. Then she unfolded the planting map. Lines ran outward from a small square marked Reed and Vale marker shed. 43 nursery rows were drawn in brown ink. Beside several trees, Eleanor's initials appeared with dates, graft numbers, and parent stock. Arrows led from her experimental seedlings to orchards, churchyards, and family farms across Washington County. In the lower corner, Amos had written, "These survived the freeze. Keep their names." Hannah placed the map beneath a piece of clean glass from the counter. The records had not merely preserved her mother's work. They showed where it had gone. Night came before she noticed the room had cooled. She wrapped the notes, receipts, metal tools, and unopened letter in fresh cloth, then returned them to the tin box. She carried it outside and sat beside the well where runoff from the Slate Hills fed a narrow creek beyond the walnuts. The water moved black beneath the moon. Once a muskrat crossed the surface, leaving a widening seam behind it. Hannah held the sealed letter on her knees, but did not break it. Some words required daylight, a clean table, and hands that had stopped shaking. Behind her, the first fire settled into red coals. The stone had kept what the family could not. Morning entered through the broken back window in a pale strip. Hannah set the tin box on the counter, washed her hands with boiled well water, and laid the sealed letter beneath the clean glass. The writing on the envelope leaned slightly forward, each capital cut narrow and exact. She knew it before she opened it. Amos had written the nursery labels that way when cold made his fingers stiff. She loosened the flap with steam rather than tearing it. "My dear one, whoever you are. If you have opened the lettering frame, then either the roof has finally failed or someone patient has returned to this place. Both events were expected. I am writing from Mary McClellan Hospital in Cambridge, New York, where Dr. Samuel Hart has told me the fibrosis in my lungs will not reverse. He gives me less than one winter. I believe him because he has the grave habit of polishing his spectacles before giving bad news. You should know whose hands came before yours." Silas Reed began cutting slate in Granville in 1869 and built this shed in 1878 with his daughter Margaret, born in Pulteney in 1854. Margaret married Elias Vale and taught their son, Amos, born here in 1894, to letter names without crowding the final letter. Amos married Ruth Bell of Whitehall in 1921. Their daughter Eleanor, born in 1928, learned nursery grafting at Geneva, New York, and returned with a talent greater than any of us understood. Hannah Reed, born in Glens Falls in 1951, was the fourth generation to work at this bench, though she was still a child when these records began. The trade closed on October 14, 1948. There have been 37 years of silence since the last paid marker left this room. Silence is not the same as failure. After my brother Thomas was killed in France during the Second World War, one could no longer cut memorial stones for money. I made garden markers instead because beans, pears, and lilies required names too, and because the living should not surrender every careful word to graves. Eleanor's grafts became the work that mattered most. Her cold, hardy seedlings survived winters that killed whole orchard rows. Nurseries copied the stock, sometimes honestly and sometimes not. The enclosed receipts are royalties they finally paid. The planting map shows where her grafts went. Keep it dry. Her work deserves a witness, even if no crowd ever gathers. If you use the slate warm frozen blanks indoors for 12 hours before splitting them, cut across the bedding plane at no steeper than 15 degrees. For hand lettering, mix 1 part lampblack with 3 parts boiled linseed oil and let it rest 20 minutes before rubbing it into the cuts. Sharpen carbide points every 40 feet of lettering, not when they begin to drag. A dull tool makes a careful hand look careless. Inheritance is not the box, the notes, or the tools. It is knowing why a blade is honed before it is needed, why a name must remain legible after the person who carved it is gone, and why one good marker can keep a living thing from being mistaken for a weed. Use the money slowly. Repair the roof before you repair the sign. Feed yourself. Pay debts that were honestly made. Leave something behind for a person you will never meet. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Nathaniel Reed, November 6, 1985. Hannah read the letter twice. The second time, she rested one finger beneath each line as Amos had once guided her chalk spacing. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, pressed them flat with the brass dividers, and returned the envelope to the tin box. She did not wipe her face. She wiped the counter. Behind the shed, the planting map showed a mark near the creek, 12 paces from the western walnut. Hannah carried the map through the back door and measured with her boots. Nettles had grown through a fallen rail. Beneath them, half buried in silt, stood a slate marker no taller than her hand. She cleared it with the grafting knife's wooden handle. The letters remained shallow but readable. Eleanor's first northern suite, grafted May 3, 1946. Beside the marker, rose an apple tree, twisted by weather, hollow on one side and still carrying 6 tight leaf buds. Hannah touched the bark where an old graft union had swollen into a dark seam. The tree had survived without anyone left to call it by name. Back inside, she searched the heirloom package again and found a small slate oil lamp beneath the apron. Its brass burner was green with age, but the wick lifted when she turned the wheel. She cleaned the reservoir, added a little lamp oil from Walter's emergency shelf, and struck a match. The flame began as a blue line, then steadied gold. Its light reached the lettering frame, the planting map, and Amos's tools arranged on the feed sack. For the first time, the front room held light that had belonged to the family before Hannah was born. She began to understand how she had arrived there, not through one rescue, but through several small permissions. The church cook had paid $4 for 2 herb pots and wrapped boiled eggs in wax paper. The farmer outside Fort Anne had pointed toward a dry corner of his hay barn without demanding an explanation. Mrs. Pike had pressed the county seal into the deed and told her to keep the record dry. Walter Klein had opened a credit ledger beneath her name before she possessed anything worth securing. None of them had solved her life. Each had merely placed one soundboard across a gap. Before this story continues, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not have known how badly you needed it. Tell us in the comments what it was and if you still can speak that person's name. Quiet help deserves to remain visible. That night, Hannah wrapped Amos's hammer and Eleanor's grafting knife in the stoneworker's apron and placed them beside her bedding. The tin box rested beneath her shoulder. The slate lamp burned low until the room smelled faintly of warm oil. Outside rain began softly on the roof. Amos had told her to mend first. The first snow came on December soon, 4 inches by noon, soft enough to hide the broken shingles and heavy enough to show every place the roof sagged. Hannah carried the repair booklet to the stove and read the roofing chapter 3 times, tracing each diagram with a flour-dusted finger. The shed roof measured 18 by 32 feet, 2 slopes, requiring roughly 12 squares of slate coverage once waste was counted. Walter helped her calculate the underlayer, 6 rolls of felt, 240 replacement slates from a demolition pile, and 20 pounds of copper nails because iron would stain the stone and fail sooner. He set a roofing hatchet on the counter. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." The handle was polished pale where another hand had gripped it for years. A retired roofer named Edwin Marsh arrived the next morning in a red wool cap carrying a level longer than Hannah's arm. He had heard about the roof from Walter and refused the envelope containing $3. "Buy felt," he said. They sistered the worst rafter with a full-length hemlock board, clamped it tight, and drove bolts through sound wood. Edwin snapped a chalk line across the lower course, showed Hannah how to leave the proper headlap, and taught her to seat each copper nail with 3 strokes, 1 to place, 1 to drive, 1 light tap to finish. "That nail's proud." Hannah checked the head. "Pull it." They worked 11 days through sleet-numb fingers, and one afternoon when the wind lifted an entire sheet of felt against the chimney. By December 15, the ridge lay straight. The replacement slates sat in clean, staggered courses, and meltwater reached the eaves without entering the rooms. That night, snow slid from the repaired north slope in one long whisper. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Several bricks near the roofline had begun to spall their faces, peeling into orange scales. Mortar beneath them powdered under Hannah's thumb. She dismantled the loose courses 1 brick at a time, numbering each with chalk before lowering it in a bucket. Walter supplied hydraulic lime and fire clay. Hannah mixed 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the inner joints, adding water slowly until the mixture held a ridge without slumping. She soaked each old brick before resetting it so dry clay would not steal moisture from the bed. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that remained in the 20s. Gloves became clumsy around the narrow joints, so she used bare hands until they went numb, warming them against the stove every 15 minutes. On bad mornings, mortar froze at the edge of the board before she could lift it. She rebuilt the upper courses, replaced the cracked flue collar, and packed the crown with a slight outward slope to shed rain. A sheet metal cap from Walter's scrap bin finished the top. On January 28th, Hannah lit a test fire with newspaper dry kindling and 1 split of maple. Smoke entered the throat, rose without hesitation, and drew cleanly past the new crown. She stood outside beneath the chimney until the first thin plume disappeared into the gray sky. Beneath mud, slate, dust, and mouse staining the floors were white pine. The planks ran the length of the shed, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails darkened almost black. Hannah set each raised head with a nail punch before bringing in the rented random orbit sander from Granville Hardware at $14 per day. The first pass, 80 grit, removed grime in the splintered surface without erasing the shallow wear around the workbench. The second, 120, quieted the sanding marks. The final pass at 220 left the boards smooth enough to catch light, but not so smooth that they forgot their age. Dust entered everything. It settled in Hannah's hair, inside the stove hinges, and along the lip of Amos's tin box despite 2 cloth coverings. She vacuumed the joints with Walter's borrowed shop machine and wiped the floor twice with mineral spirits. 3 coats of oil followed, each rubbed thin with cotton cloth. The floor cured for 48 hours, while Hannah slept in the back room and stepped only on 2 temporary planks. As the oil settled, the pine shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, revealing growth rings that ran like narrow weather maps beneath her feet. One morning she woke unable to lift the brush. She walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows with one leg hidden, its reflection trembling whenever the creek moved. Hannah remained there until afternoon and did no work that day. The following morning she returned and finished the final coat. There were 8 windows in all. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and one west-facing pane remained original, its surface wavering with trapped seeds and faint distortions from 1788. Hannah marked that sash with chalk and worked around it as carefully as if the glass were skin. She removed the loose putty with a glazing knife warmed near the stove, scraped each rabbit clean, and brushed the wood with linseed oil before bedding the replacement panes. DAP 33 glazing putty softened between her palms. She rolled it into narrow ropes, pressed it beneath the glass, set glazier's points every 8 inches, then tooled the outer bevel in one continuous pull. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Hannah replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowering each iron counterweight by hand and securing it with a figure-8 knot that tightened under load without slipping. She repaired the windows one at a time, testing every sash before moving on. The original pane remained untouched except for a soft cloth and clean water. On the final window, Hannah lowered the upper sash and felt both counterweights take evenly. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch, turned its black-capped head toward the glass, and stayed until she pressed the last line of putty smooth. The walls had been waiting beneath paper and soot. Hannah stripped away the loose layers near the chimney and found horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath, each strip narrow and uneven, held by square nails. Her first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged from the lath. The third dried with a hollow center and fell when she touched it. Walter brought an old burlap bag from his loft. Inside was clean horsehair saved by his father from a carriage shop. Hannah mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed through every handful. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath and left its surface rough. Over that came a 3/8-inch brown coat leveled with a cedar float and cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat was 1/8 inch thin, enough to follow the old wall rather than disguise it. She smoothed the last patch beside the chimney with a steel trowel. These patches will hold another 100 years. The line stayed inside her, quiet and exact. Doris Bell from the Slate Valley Diner began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a broad woman with silver hair pinned by 2 crossed pencils, and each bag held something that could be eaten with one hand: biscuits, hard-boiled eggs, slices of meatloaf wrapped in wax paper. Hannah carried money to the diner after the 3rd delivery. Doris pushed the bills back across the counter with one flour-marked finger. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She returned to cutting pie as though the arrangement had already been entered in a ledger. Caleb Marsh arrived one Saturday on a red Schwinn, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, and wore one boot repaired with copper wire. Without asking, he began breaking the fallen walnut limbs behind the shed into stove lengths. Hannah offered him 50 cents. He shook his head and reset the maul. "My mother said, about your grandfather." That was all. He stacked the wood bark side up beneath the eaves and rode away before dark. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk toward the village. He had a rust-colored beard and polished shoes unsuited to Truthville Road. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat to Hannah, paused beside the repaired windows, and offered the same 4-word prayer: "Keep her hands steady." Then he continued down the road, leaving no pamphlet and asking for no answer. Their help did not crowd the shed. It arrived, performed one useful task, and made room for silence again. Hannah postponed the cellar until February 11. The entrance lay beneath a trapdoor behind the workbench. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor where meltwater had left pale mineral rings. She carried the slate lamp first, then a bucket brush and short pry bar. At the center of the cellar stood a dressed granite slab set level among rough stones. A carved mark crossed its face, a chisel over a young apple branch, the old symbol stamped on several royalty receipts. Hannah swept around it but did not lift it. Under the 3rd stair, her brush struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged behind the riser, protected by a strip of roofing slate. Its lid opened without force. Inside lay a brass key, green at the teeth, with a bow shaped like the crossed chisel and apple branch. Beneath it rested a tintype wrapped in black cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the shed before the walnuts had thickened. She held a slate hammer at her side. The face was Hannah's face, narrowed by another century, the same level brows, the same uneven lower lip, the same careful stare into the lens. On the back, written in brown ink, were the words, "Clara Reed, daughter of Silas Reed, age 25, summer of 1903. Hannah carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the lamp. She tried it in the deed box, the front door, the workbench drawers, and the rusted lettering frame. It opened nothing. The key remained on the mantel, waiting without explanation. In March, the snow withdrew from the stone walls in gray folds. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the front room. By April, the walnuts released pale catkins that hung above the repaired windows like loose green threads. Hannah cleaned Amos's chisels and sharpened only one. She decided not to begin the full trade that spring. The old lettering frame needed new guides, her spacing still wandered on long words, and Eleanor's planting map deserved more than enthusiasm. She would spend one Indian head cent from the cash as a promise, trading it to Walter for 2 small slate offcuts and a spoonful of lampblack. On those samples, she practiced straight stems, curved bowls, and the measured space between letters. She cut no family names, she accepted no orders. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Hannah completed the first marker she was willing to call finished. The slate had come from a discarded Granville roofing block split to 3/8 of an inch and rested indoors for 12 hours. She beveled its edges with the old burnishing stone, ruled the lettering in chalk, and sharpened the carbide point before the final word. The marker read Northern Sweet, followed by Eleanor Reed Stock, 1946. She rubbed lampblack and boiled linseed oil into the cuts, waited 20 minutes, and wiped the face clean. Outside, she pressed the marker into the soil beside the surviving apple tree. Snow gathered in the carved letters but did not hide them. Inside, the shed had become spare and usable. The white pine floor held a long work table beneath the west windows. Amos's tools hung in order above the lettering frame. Eleanor's grafting knife rested in a shallow drawer lined with wool. The stove drew cleanly, the plaster walls carried the soft irregularity of handwork, and the original 1788 pane-bent winter light across the ceiling. Nothing had been made new merely to look new. The brass key remained on the mantel until a windstorm in January split a dead limb from the western walnut. Caleb came with a saw. When the limb fell, its torn base exposed a square iron plate set deep in the trunk and nearly swallowed by bark. The plate bore the cross chisel and apple branch. Hannah brought the key from the mantel. It turned once. Behind the plate was a copper-lined hollow no larger than a bread box. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth and a letter dated August 19, 1944. The paper belonged to Clara Reed, the woman in the tintype. Thomas has been gone 7 weeks, she had written. The army says France, though not where. Amos has closed the memorial order book. He cannot cut another name for the dead. We have folded this flag because grief should not be left open to weather. Keep it until someone can carry his medal without needing to make a story larger than his life. Below the note, Clara had added planting instructions for the western walnut 12 feet from the creek bank roots spread toward water grafting ash mixed 1 part to 4 parts soil. Hannah refolded the letter along Clara's creases. The flag remained in its oilcloth until spring, when Mrs. Pike helped her confirm Thomas Vale's service record. On June 6, 2024, the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings, Hannah carried the Purple Heart to Gerald B. H. Solomon Saratoga National Cemetery. There was no ceremony arranged for her. She stood beside the flag line at noon, read Thomas's name once, and placed a small slate marker beneath a maple until sunset. The money remained mostly untouched. Hannah used 4 coins, the Indian head cent, for her first practice slate, 1 Mercury dime for cotton cord, a Walking Liberty $half toward lamp oil, and 1 Morgan dollar to replace the lettering frame's bent brass guide. Walter recorded each exchange at face value, though both knew the silver was worth more. The savings notes, certificates, and royalty receipts went into archival sleeves. Hannah sealed them inside the repaired compartment beneath the hinged rack, together with a copy of the planting map and Amos's letter. On the outer wrapping, she wrote, "For the next one, use slowly." The shed reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned 1 index card to the diner's corkboard. Hand-lettered slate garden markers, plant names only, Reed Shed, Truthville Road. The first request came from a woman needing 6 markers for her mother's herb garden. The second came from a school restoring an apple row. By autumn, Hannah kept a mailing list of 43 names in a narrow ledger, though she accepted only as many orders as she could cut without hurrying. She still closed the shed on Sundays. Caleb returned in October carrying a long board beneath one arm. He had grown broad through the shoulders and no longer needed copper wire around his boot. He had carved the missing words from the original sign, matching the worn letter forms Hannah found beneath the paint. Reed and Vale garden markers, it read. Below the name on a separate strip of walnut Caleb had carved. And daughters. Hannah looked from the sign to him. There were daughters, he said. He mounted the board above the door and refused payment until Hannah offered him one of Doris's promised candles. Caleb accepted the candle, lit it in the stove flame, and set it on the workbench while they watched snow begin over the lane. That winter, Hannah began her own letter. She used heavy paper, Amos's brass dividers for the margins, and Eleanor's grafting knife to sharpen the pencil. She wrote slowly because the person who might read it had not yet been born or had not yet lost enough to seek shelter in an abandoned place. My dear one, whoever you are. She explained where the well cover caught in winter, which roof slates should be watched after a hard freeze, and why the western apple must never be pruned during thaw. She listed Walter's ledger, Doris's candles, Caleb's sign, and Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayer. She did not write that the shed had saved her. She wrote that it had required her to become careful. The finished letter went into the compartment beside Amos's. Hannah left one sharpened carbide point, 3 clean slate blanks, and a new planting map showing every surviving tree descended from Eleanor's stock. Then she closed the cedar disc and turned it 1/4 rotation. The stone had kept what the family could not. Outside, the sign moved gently in the evening wind. Smoke rose from the straight chimney. The repaired windows held their light, including the old pane that bent every flame into two. The slate garden marker shed waits. It has always waited. Years later, when Mrs. Pike retired, the new deputy clerk emptied the bottom drawer of her desk. Beneath old sealing wax and 2 broken pencil stubs lay a folded dollar bill, the first of Hannah's $4 kept instead of deposited. Across its edge, Mrs. Pike had written one word in blue ink: read.